everyone for joining us this afternoon. I think we have a very interesting panel. My name is Matthew Bosler. I cover the Fed and the U.S. economy for Bloomberg. And I'm especially excited to hear what these presenters have to say. I was just explaining to some of them that the Fed has, over the last few years since the crisis, really stepped up its efforts to communicate with the public what they're doing, why they're doing it, to the extent that they just had a meeting on Wednesday, and they had a blackout period where they were not allowed to communicate with the public around the meeting. And that blackout period just lifted today, and just today you had 3 Fed presidents out at various places giving speeches, sort of explaining the narrative of their take on the economy and monetary policy and how it works, why they're doing what they're doing, and so on and so forth. And I think it's safe to say you'll probably hear a very different story or views today from this panel. So with that, I'll turn it over to Paul, who is going to get us started. And we'll go 15 minutes each, and then I'll give you guys a 5-minute warning, and then we'll turn it over to questions.
Right. 81 years ago, John Maynard Keynes wrote a classic in economics called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. A classic in economics is defined as a book everybody cites but nobody reads. and just so, how many people here have read The General Theory from cover to cover? I'd say maybe 7 or 8 out of this group, probably 70 people, maybe 10%, okay? I once asked Paul Samuelson about it, and he said, oh, he read it, but he found that it was completely unpalatable. And in fact, he's quoted in a book called Coming of Keynesian to America. He's asked this question again, and he says, the general theory is completely unpalatable, and therefore he can't accept it. But he says it was so successful in the Roosevelt administration, he therefore assumed that what Keynes meant to say was that this was a slow adjusting Walrasian system, so that in the short run, wages and prices didn't adjust quickly enough to get the full employment. In the long run, you'd get the full employment anyhow, but he was too impatient to wait for the long run, so that's why he advocated deficit spending, so you could get to it in the short run as well as the long run. Now, in their book, General Competitive Equilibrium, Kenneth Arrow and Frank Hahn say the following, and I want to quote it directly, because you wouldn't believe it. The terms in which contracts are made matter. In particular, if money is the goods in terms of which contracts are made, then the price of goods in terms of money are of special significance. This is not the case if we consider an economy without a past or a present or a future. If a serious monetary theory comes to be written, the fact that contracts are made in terms of money will be of considerable importance, unquote. Now, Keynes wrote the liquidity theory of money. And what is liquidity? If you have liquidity, you have the ability to meet all your contractual obligations. And the last seminar, somebody talked about this is one form of money, and it says, this note is legal tender for all debts per private public, okay? And that means when you have a debt, it's a contract. And money is that thing which discharges all contractual obligations, even if you're not the buyer. If you're the seller, if I'm selling you economic lectures, you're going to pay me, and then I don't deliver them. I say, I'm sorry, I got to go somewhere else. What can you do? You can sue me for the costs involved in not having these economic lectures, and I can meet my contractual obligation not by giving you the lectures, because slavery is illegal, you can't make me give them, but by giving you a sum of money that the court says is sufficient to compensate you. So money solves all contractual obligations, and that's what Keynes' theory of money was. Liquidity, liquidity, liquidity. Okay. And you have time-oriented contracts. You have spot contracts, which are immediate, and forward contracts. And the question is, why do we have contracts? Winston Churchill once said, democracy, no one says democracy is all wise and all knowing, but is best, it's pretty effective, but it's the best form of government that ever been historically tried. And Keynes might be equivalently said that the monetary market system that we have does not, people are not all wise and all knowing as they are in orthodox theory. Of course, in the orthodox theory, you know the future. And he said you don't know the future. But nevertheless, this money using market economy is the best economic system ever devised historically. Now, why do you have to know the future in classical economics? Well, time is a device which prevents everything from happening at once. Whenever you make a decision to buy this, invest in that, and so on and so forth, the payout will be a day later, a week later, a month later, a year later. And if you're going to maximize, you have to know what the payout is and when it is. Otherwise, you can't be making maximization. You can think you're maximizing, but you can end up making terrible mistakes. Okay? So those people who believe in free markets, markets will solve everything, are assuming all the decision makers know the future, and therefore they don't make any mistakes, and therefore if government interferes, it's only preventing people from maximizing, and when everybody in the system maximizes, we're in the best of all possible worlds. I have a quote from Thomas Sargent about this. In a few minutes I'll give it to you. Now, one of the essential things about a market-oriented economy that we live in is that all market transactions are organized via money-denominated contracts. Just think about it. Your rent, your employment contract, every contract you enter into. And what do you attempt to do? You don't know the future, but you attempt to maintain liquidity. You attempt to enter into all sorts of contracts for payments today or in the future, payments to you today and in the future, and you use the various contracts that are eligible to you to make sure that there's always a sufficient cash in your bank account, so that the cash inflows, or I should put it the other way, the cash outflows don't exceed the cash inflows, because what happens if you run out of money in the bank account? You got to march to the gallows. We call it bankruptcy, right? Okay. And the essence of a capitalist money-using system is the sanctity of the money contract. There's nothing more sanctity, nothing more important than people doing what they said they would do in a contractual obligation. And this is what Keynes is all about. So Keynes is the only one that I know of who has a serious monetary theory. Milton Friedman has it. I got it, and I'll have a quote from Milton Friedman, which he admits he doesn't think that's important. Okay, so are we all agreed that money contracts is the way every market operates? Can you think of any market that doesn't have a money contract? Well, what about classical economics? In classical economics, or mainstream economics, it's real contracts. You're exchanging 2 chickens for 3 heads of lettuce. And in fact, if you really look at Balrazian theory, which is all barter theory, the demand curves are not a single price, but it's a relative price. Okay, so it's always, the demands are always real demands, not monetary demands. Whereas in the real world, if there is such a thing as a demand curve that shows people's reaction to various money prices, it's all money. So if you're going to have modern monetary theory, the first thing you should recognize, and this sort of challenges the people who think that taxation is the cause of money, the importance of money comes from the fact that people in a market-oriented monetary using system must enter into monetary contracts. It's legal contracts, not your legal tax debt. And I have examples where that occurs. As a veteran of the Korean War, I could give you a story about in Korea, soldiers were paid Militaryscrip. That's not, Militaryscrip is not U.S. dollars. They're U.S. dollars, but they have written on it that they're only usable at the post exchange. And why did we pay TIs Militaryscrip? Because we didn't want them to have transactions with the civilian population for wine, women, and song. Okay? And so you didn't pay them in foreign currency, and you paid in military scrip, it's only the post exchange. But nevertheless, the GIs wanted to engage in transactions for wine, women, and so on. And winemakers, the women, and the song makers were willing to engage and sell for military scrip, which they can't use because it's only used on the post exchange. Why? See? And the answer was they knew that if somehow they could get to the post exchange, they could buy things at the post exchange which they couldn't get in the local economy, cigarettes, scotch, all sorts of things that were not easily available. So what they did was they would sell these things. Military scrip would get into the civilian population. They used military scrip for their own contracts rather than the local government. They only used the Korean won to pay their taxes, but they never used it for they used military scrip. Why? Because they knew when they got enough military scrip, they could bribe a GI to take the military scrip to the post office, buy them, they'd give a list of products, and they would buy them and deliver it to them, and the GI would get a certain amount of percentage. Okay? So taxation in Korea during the war was not the cause of the use of money. And there were other examples of it. Coal industry in West Virginia and so on. We had coal mines. The major employer with the coal industry, they paid their workers not in dollars, but in company scrip. And the company scrip was only good in the company stores, and the coal mine workers were quite willing, this was before the Second World War, were quite willing to accept scrip, which they could not use to buy something from from Amazon, I should say, or Sears Roebuck catalog, which was the Amazon of the 1930s. Okay. Now, the question is, and you heard it, some of you may have heard it, the argument was, well, money lubricates, we really do real transactions, but in neoclassical economics, money is a lubricant, makes it easier to figure out the number of lettuce versus tomatoes and so on and so forth. Well, Varra said that's not true, and if you believe in the Varasian system, money has nothing to play. There is no money in the Varasian system, and there's no financial system in the Varasian system. Okay. And free competitive markets, because everybody knows the future, become the way of maximizing everybody's income and wealth. Therefore, anything the government does to interfere with the marketplace is going to lower wealth and maximization. Therefore, laissez-faire is the immediate outcome of a barter economy, basically. Okay. Now, Alan Greenspan was called in front of a congressional committee in October 2008 to explain why the financial crisis had occurred. And he said the following thing, and I quote, "Those of us who had looked to the self-interest of lending institutions to protect shareholders' equity, parenthesis, myself especially, close parenthesis, are in a state of shocked disbelief." The global financial crisis showed them that entrepreneurs don't look for their own self-interest somehow or other, or at least don't get their own self-interest involved. Okay? And the question is, why don't they do that? And I'll have another quote from Alan to explain why he can't understand why they don't do it in a second. Okay, why didn't any of these people in Goldman Sachs, or even in the Federal Reserve, or Council of Economic Advisors, or the IMF, all these brilliant economists, why did none of them see the 2007-8 crisis occurring? Queen Elizabeth is quoted as going to London School of Economics after the crisis and asking the head of the economics in London School of Economics, did anybody foresee this coming? And his answer is no, it's not true, because I wrote it in 2005, a book which said the global financial crisis was coming. I couldn't tell when, but I knew it was coming. And the answer, so why did it happen? And the answer the classical economist gave him was everybody thought they were doing a good thing. You were giving people mortgages who normally couldn't afford the houses, so they got houses. You gave the lenders a higher rate of interest because they got better houses. So everybody was doing a good thing. Unfortunately, it turns out that it wasn't a good thing, and why not? Now, let me go on here. One of the questions I often ask is, what causes unemployment in macroeconomics? And when you teach macroeconomics, you probably use a textbook of macroeconomics by Mankiw or somebody like that. What causes unemployment? Why is there unemployment? Well, if you believe Samuelson, it's because of the Walrasian system, where if you're at less than full employment, wages do not fall sufficiently to create full employment. Well, why don't they fall sufficiently? Well, it's labor unions, it's the truculence of workers who refuse to take a lower wage. So the villains in the piece are the victims. Workers are unemployed because they don't want to work at the market clearing wage, okay? And so they're entitled to be victims, so to speak. Now, Keynes actually has a whole chapter explaining why that's not true. Okay, and in essence, what is his explanation? It's very simple. If you think of an aggregate supply curve, an aggregate demand curve, the aggregate supply curve depends on the costs of production. And as you hire more workers, it's upward sloping. Aggregate demand curve is the usual demand. Higher employment is more aggregate demand. And the two intersect at a point which is called effective demand. And that turns out to be at less than full employment. If you lower the wage, what will happen, Keynes says? Well, the aggregate supply curve will go down because the cost at all levels of employment will go down. So if the aggregate demand curve doesn't change, the intersection will be further to the west. There'll be more employment. But he says, unfortunately, if wages go down, wage income goes down. Money wage income goes down. And if money wage income goes down, money consumption out of wages go down. So you have the demand curve shifting down as well as the supply curve. They will intersect, but he says there's no evidence to say that it will intersect at a higher level than it was before, or even at the full employment level. So Keynes, in this chapter on changes in money wages, demonstrates that there's nothing to say that falling wages or reducing the money wage will create full employment, despite what all the mainstream Keynesian books say. Okay?
Well, 1 minute.
And the reason why the Keynesian books all say that is because they assume that even though you cut the wage, market demand does not change. So the aggregate demand curve stays where it is, and if you let the aggregate supply curve fall, the intersection has to be further and further towards full employment. If it falls enough, the intersection will always be at full employment. Okay. Why? Question is, why money contracts? And here is, Keynes says there's uncertainty in the economy, and the existence of money contracts allows decision makers to deal with uncertainty. That's the only way you can deal with uncertainty. Why? Because in a business, if you're an economist and making an economic person, and you're making decisions to buy things and sell things, you have to make sure that your cash outflow doesn't exceed your cash inflow. And you can do that if you engage in enough spot and forward contracts so that you have a forward contract that ensures you a certain amount of cash inflow, and in cash outflow you control it by engaging in contracts which specify at what date you have to pay for these things. So money contracts is the way that we deal with uncertainty. And if you're a good dealer, you'll always have a precautionary cash balance in your checking account, and you'll never run into problems with meeting your obligations. I did raise it earlier today, the question of student debt. We tell students to engage in a forward contract for educational services in which they have to pay for it currently. We call that tuition. And the question is, well, they don't have the money to pay their tuition now, so we get the banks to loan them the money, so they pay for their tuition now. How are they going to pay their debt? well, if you believe Milton Friedman or Gary Becker, this education is going to lead them to higher income in the future because it's an investment in human capital. And we know the return on human capital, right? Just like we know the return on plant and equipment in the Orthodox mainstream theory. So the human capital that the student knows, at least if he's a neoclassical student, he knows that he's going to have enough future income to pay off the student debt and still live more comfortably than if he didn't have any education. In reality, of course, we're going to see a tremendous amount of student debt defaults, and that's going to create the next big financial crisis, I think. Okay. Now, in the Walrasian system, how did people know the future? They had an auctioneer. The auctioneer told them what the conditions of the spot market today was, and what the forward market every day in the future till eternity was. So you can make a decision about whether to buy today, tomorrow, 6 months from now, 16 years from now, and so on, because you know all the conditions. We don't have any Walrasian auctioneer to do that. So uncertainty becomes the important thing. Okay. Now, Sargent, by the way, writing about, and I think this is an important quote, Sargent, writing about rational expectation, says the following. This rational expectations, quote, imputes to the people inside the model much more knowledge about the system that they are operating in than is available to the economist or the econometrician who is using the model to try and understand their behavior. In particular, an econometrician faces the problem of estimating probability distribution and laws of motion that the agents in the model already are assumed to know. So that's why they solve the problem and the econometricians don't. Now, I've argued that the economic system is basically a non-ergodic system, which means that probability distributions in the past cannot be used to predict the future. In insurance cases, of course, they can. If your house burns down, it's because we have kinds of houses like you live in, and we know what percentage burned down in the past, and the insurance company sues the same what burned down in the future. The insurance company backs out from the contract by saying, except your insurance, fire insurance, okay, except in times of war. Because in times of war, more houses are going to burn down, and so when things change, they're out of the contract. Okay, so
We're about out.
all right. Let me just finish. Let me just say, astronomy. Take the case of astronomy. We just had a solar eclipse. Astronomers can predict a solar eclipse within a few seconds of where it's going to occur in Earth and when the next one's going to come 5 or 10 years from now. Why? Because they measure the movement of all the heavenly bodies and the velocity, and then they project the movement in the past is going to be the same as the movement in the future, which is what we do in econometric models, by the way. Okay? And therefore, Congress cannot pass a law which says solar eclipses are illegal. And if we get rid of solar eclipses, we'll have more sunshine, and therefore we'll be able to produce more agriculture, and the gross domestic product will rise because of the additional production of agriculture. Okay? Why can the astronomer predict where the future of the heavenly planets are going to be, and the economists can't predict where the economy is going to be in the future? And the answer is because we don't have the match of probabilities in the past entering the future. And that, of course, was the main story of Keynes. Okay, and let me see if there's any. I have a quote from Alan Greenspan to this conversation. He doesn't understand why it occurred. He believes that the self-interest of the financial institutions should have protected the equity of their stockholders, and they should have seen this coming. And they didn't. He says, I don't understand why, because after all, the financial market risk model won a Nobel Prize in economics, okay, and somehow or other it didn't work. So the whole, and again, he uses these words, the intellectual edifice of these, basically econometrics, has collapsed. And he says, and if I find out why it has, I'll let you know. And the answer is very simple. If he read Keynes, he would have known. The world is uncertain. You cannot predict the economic future, and you can try and hedge yourself. Just think, if you can predict the economic future, what is the price of Apple stocks going to be tomorrow, or a week from tomorrow, or a year from tomorrow? Can't we all make a fortune? Why can't you predict the future? You're all econometricians, right? Can't you just look at the past and you know how Apple stock grew in the past? Just project the growth in the future. All right? So where do we end up? Liquidity becomes the important point. People want liquidity, and a penny saved, Benjamin Franklin was wrong. A penny saved is a penny that you want to put in some liquid asset, so you can, if you have to have contractual obligation, you can pay for it. So a penny saved is a penny not earned by anybody else. And a penny spent on goods and services is a penny someone else is going to earn. So deficit spending is good when there's too much savings in the private sector, so that not enough income is being generated. The spending of the government, deficit spending, is going to create more earnings, okay? Keynes, of course, ends up with that, but in the classical economics, whenever somebody saves, who's the offset? You have to have offsetting dis-savings to prevent the income from falling. And the argument was that investors would be always borrowing the savings of the savers at dollar for dollar or pound for pound, so that there would never be a shortage of aggregate demand, says or withhold. That, so the bumper sticker for modern post-Keynesian monetary theory is a penny spent is a penny earned. A penny saved is going to create some unemployment problem. And I'll stop at that point.
So my presentation, so while we wait, it's basically what I tried to do in this presentation and in the paper that backs it, is to merge together the state theory and the credit theory of money by using what we call the financial approach to money. And the goal is to try to provide an alternative to the functional approach of money. Money is what money does. It's a fundamental paper on monetary analysis, basically. And so this paper, what we'll do in it first is look at the difference between the functional and the financial approach to money, and look at what a monetary instrument is in the financial approach. Then look at the state and credit view and see how you can basically see that they are the same approach but from a different perspective. And then see how this is related to post-Keynesian approach, circuit, and the regulationists also that have worked a lot on the monetary issues. So first, the functional approach. So this is pretty famous here. Money is what money does. So if you want to figure out where there is a financial monetary instrument, what you only need to look at is there a medium of exchange? Okay, so if you still in the past economic system, look for a medium of exchange or any of your favorite functions of money. Okay. So you pick and choose, and if you have a general medium, that's even better. The puzzle, though, that you get if you try to put that framework in a general equilibrium model is that the fair price of money is 0. So how do you solve that model, that puzzle? Well, one solution that I have come up with is to say that, well, we use money because of conventions. Okay, well, why does Mr. X accept
a $5 note at $5? Well, because it knows that Mr. Y will accept it at $5. And why does Mr. Y accept it at 5? Because Mr. Z will accept it at 5. You go on and on and on like this. Okay. So that's the solution they propose. And here I'll show you an alternative way to understand why people accept the $5 note at $5. So the functional approach is money is what money is. So you are not going to look at what it does. You're going to try to study its real nature. And the net present value of a monetary instrument is face value. And so here, what you want to emphasize is not so much social trust. The trust that bearers have among each other. I know that I bear a Federal Reserve note. I know that I will be able to give it to someone at $5 would be very expensive. This will be the case. Okay, here what you emphasize instead is the trust in the issuer of the monetary instrument. And so X accepts a banknote at $5 because he knows that he can redeem it, that is, send it back to the issuer at any time for $5. Okay. So what you need to study then is the adequacy of the means used to enforce the term to maturity and to enforce the fair price. So you need to study the redemption or deflux mechanisms. How do you ensure that? How does an issuer ensure that a $5 note always circulates at $5? And so here is a classification of financial instruments by term to maturity. And so monetary instruments are just a specific financial instrument, one with a zero term and zero coupon. It's a zero term, zero coupon security basically. So its fair price is going to be face value. And at the other extreme, you have irredeemable financial instruments, so stocks and perpetual bonds. And their fair price is basically the coupon for the perpetual is the coupon divided by the interest rate. And any of these, and you can of course go in between where you have the traditional fair price valuation based on net present value. Okay. But any of those are basically promises that are made by an issuer. And so the question is, do you trust the issuer? And how does the issuer enforces the payment or make sure that it can fulfill the promise that is embedded in the instrument? So who can create monetary instruments? Basically anybody can. Okay? It's like creating a pizza coupon. Basically it's a promise that you're making or you're issuing a monetary instrument. What do you promise when you issue a monetary instrument? You redeem it at any time. So any bearer can return it to you at any time on demand. And you promise to redeem it at face value. Okay. What's the difficulty of the promise? Well, it's hard to fulfill. Okay. And so potential bearers must believe that it is possible to redeem at any time and at face value. If you are an issuer and people don't believe that you can fulfill this, then they won't accept it at all, or they will only accept it at a discount. So today we have too many issuers, we have the government and banks. And we'll see why they are the main issuers. So main point is acceptance is based on the trust in the issuer. It's not so much trust among each other that we have that we will be able to accept among each other. You have to look at the issuer. In the same way, a bond, okay, we don't accept it because we know each other will accept it. Okay, but if we know that we trust the issuer to fulfill the payments that are due on the bond. Okay, so it's the same thing for a monetary instrument. And so acceptance will be reflected in the size of the discount. Okay, so if you have general acceptance, you have a 0% discount, then it circulates as face value. If you have imperfect or no acceptance, and you go from a small discount to 100% discount, nobody will accept your monetary instrument because nobody believes they will be able to give it back to you at any time, and you will be able to redeem at face value. So For bearers to believe that they can redeem at any time at face value, well, you have two possibilities. Okay. The first one is they believe that they can make payments at any time to the issuer, and that the issuer will accept the monetary instrument they issued at face value. This is part of their promise. And then they trust that the issuer, or there is another possibility also, they trust that the issuer will exchange at any time at face value for something else. So it's possible to convert that monetary instrument into something else. So the widely accepted financial instruments are those for whom you have the ability to enforce others or to entice others to become your debtors. So government banks have a large number of debtors, and so this creates a large demand for their monetary instruments because people know they can service their debt or taxes to the issuer, banks and government. You can add a collateral such as precious metal, so you can make precious metal coins, okay? But the gold itself is not the money. Okay? It's just the collateral that is embedded in the coin. Okay? And the problem is that if your redemption mechanisms are not credible, the coins are going to disappear because the face value of the coin, okay, will go below the value of the gold, the intrinsic value. Okay. So what are potential sources of problem for a government monetary instrument? Well, the first one is if the sovereign is weak, and so the government does not or cannot enforce payments, then in that case, the monetary instrument will circulate at a discount. If the sovereign is strong, but there are not enough government monetary instrument to fulfill the payments, then the monetary instrument will circulate at a premium. Okay, so actually is some example of that is money and credit book. If the government is strong and did provide enough, but the payments are only due occasionally, okay, so that would be typical of the colonies, Massachusetts colony, for example. On the paper, it said that they issued, it said that it's you can pay on demand your taxes, but the problem is that taxes were only due once a year, so you actually cannot redeem on demand. Okay. So you cannot enforce the zero term to maturity, and so in that case, you can have problems too. Okay. Another problem is that if you promise convertibility, but you don't actually, you cannot do it. Or you make it extremely difficult for people to convert your monetary instrument in gold or anything else. I mean, in this case, you're going to have problems too. Final problem is that if the government starts to cry up or down the monetary instrument that is change the face value too much, well, in that case, it's hard to figure out what the face value is. For banks, what are potential problems? Well, they're similar to the government. They either do not accept their own monetary instruments, or they do not provide conversion into government monetary instrument or something else on demand. So again, wildcat era in the United States is a good example of that period of time. For any other issuers, it's either hard to enforce the redemption. It's hard to enforce the redemption mechanism because either you don't have any debtors, so nobody has any chance to give it back to you, either to pay your debts or to redeem it in terms of the ability to get something else in exchange. So error made in the past. Here I'm going to go through a bit of history. So one was there is no redemption clause at all. So you issue them, but you don't state that you will ever accept them back. Okay. And given that they are zero coupon securities, okay, if you never take them back, that means they are irredeemable securities with zero coupon, then their face value is zero. Okay. Another one is you have redemption clause, but there is actually no means to implement it. And so, as I told you, colonial bills and the banks here in wildcat era fulfill that kind of problem. If you have full-bodied coins, of course, the issue is that the intrinsic value of the gold can go above the face value, and then the coins are going to disappear. so crying up or down the currency. And finally, free coinage. So in the past, if you remember, you could go with your pot of gold, go to the mint and get gold points. Basically, what you have done here is legalize counterfeiting. Okay, it's like today, if you have paper that fit the characteristics of the Federal Reserve notes, you go to the mint and go to the, is it the mint that prints the Federal Reserve notes? Bureau of Engraving, yeah. So there, you go there and ask for Federal Reserve notes. Okay, so you have legalized. So state and credit theory of money. They are basically subsets of the financial approach from a different perspective. One is looking at an issuer that is a state, and the other one is looking at an issuer that are banks. Okay? And so they emphasize the importance of the promise of redemption made by the issuer. And for the state's theory, it's about taxes, okay, or any other forms of payments that are due to the government. For the credit theory, it's the role of debts and payments that debtors must make to the issuers of monetary instruments. Thanks. So you have to have a monopoly issuance over your monetary instruments, otherwise you have counterfeiting. For the circuit and post-Keynesian and regulationists, well, here one of the points is to explain in the, for example, in the post-Keynesian approach, why monetary instruments are perfectly liquid. Like Paul said, okay, you have the emphasis on monetary contracts, and so nominal values are very important, and they shape the allocation and production and distribution of resources. And so you need to explain why monetary instruments are perfectly liquid. Minsky here, there are two quotes. For the interest of time, I'll skip, but basically what he tells you is that money is like a bond. It's the same thing. And so you can understand monetary mechanics by using finance and financial logic. And that's true from gold coins to what we have today. For the regulationist approach, so Aguilita and others, so there they emphasize the role of confidence and sovereignty. Okay, so it's a natural fit for the financial approach. It's all about trust. And so monetary analysis does not start with a double coincidence of one's problem, but with the social nature of monetary system and the fact that you have debtors and creditors. You have this political aspect that is important. So conclusion, so to detect a monetary instrument, use it, figure out what its financial characteristics are. So you have a thing there, what are its financial characteristics? If it doesn't have any, then it's a commodity. And so there you don't have monetary instruments. Don't look at functions. Okay, functions are important, but not as the first point of entry in the analysis. Then you need to explain why a monetary instrument is liquid. Why do some financial instruments circulate at par? And by liquidity, we mean nominal value that is fixed. Okay, so here you need to study the financial characteristics of the instrument, the surrounding financial structure. Do you have the financial structure to ensure that the instrument can circulate at the fair price? Do we trust the issuer? And what are the redemption mechanisms, and are they adequate to fulfill the financial characteristics of the monetary instrument? And so state and credit view use the financial approach from a different perspective, and this financial approach is basically compatible with both Keynesian circuitist and the regulationist approach too. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad that Robert Skidelsky is here, because this morning he asked me who does still believe that Taylor rule is a valuable theory, and but I'm sure you know that it's almost common sense in the academia, and is common knowledge to the point that the econometric analysis is sometimes has the assumptions that basically drive the results. So in a way that they are consistent with the Taylor rule. In this paper, we take a different approach. We don't have any major theoretical assumption, and we let the data speak, so to say. And the results are not really generous with the Taylor rule, and much more consistent with the poor performance that monetary policies has had since the global financial crisis. Okay, I'm afraid there is some wrong. Yeah.
Sorry, guys.
Anyway, I start and then we will get the slide. So in this paper, we aim at comparing the empirical reliability of the Taylor rule with an alternative interpretation of the actual manners in which central banks set monetary policy variables. In particular, we consider the solvency rule, which puts into direct relationship the interest rate set by the central bank with the average solvency condition of firms. So basically, according to the Taylor rule, the interest rate is set in order to ensure the stability of inflation around the target rate and the convergence of income towards its natural equilibrium, while in the solvency rule framework, the effects of central banks' decision on growth and unemployment are to be considered uncertain and largely undetermined. Whereas the decisions on the rate of interest will mainly concern the socially acceptable rate of firms' insolvency in the economic system. So this paper is motivated by the fact that causal relationship that exists between the involved variables have been often overlooked in the economic analysis. And the empirical connection between the rate of interest, a measure of inflation, and a measure for variations in output gap cannot justify per se the claim of a clear causal relation between them. So the detected empirical regularity does not seem to us sufficient to claim the existence of causal links between these variables. So the point is that policy rules such as the Taylor rule, they rely on the supposed existence of such a causal relationship. So on the one side, we have a direction from the gap between target variables and their actual values to the values assumed by instrumental variables of monetary policy, in this case the rate of interest. On the other side, we should have the instrumental variable affecting the gap. But these links actually need to be tested, and this especially after the Great Recession. So here there is an anticipation of the results. I will go back to the results after all. But basically we found no impact of the rate of interest on inflation, and no impact or extremely low impact of the rate of interest on GDP, while we consider non-performing loans as a proxy for the solvency condition of the firms in the system. And there we found a much more significant impact. Our methodology, generally speaking, is using a structural vector autoregressive technique, and we study the causal relationship through independent component analysis and the Lingham algorithm. The approach, so, is entirely data-driven. So bringing the non-performing loans into the Taylor rule as a proxy for the general solvency condition of firms allows us to outline a system of equation which enables to investigate the causal links relevant both to a Taylor rule framework and to a solvency rule framework. This is permitted by the fact that the system has no major theoretical assumptions, in line with our data-driven approach, and it is consistent with a comparative approach based on the use of single system of equations for all the theories examined. So different or even opposite conclusions will be reached in terms of economic analysis and policy, depending on the viewpoint from which the equations are examined. Sorry. Okay, this is the attempted model we are working on. So this is just a preliminary attempt, so I will skip to the following section, but it should be clear that the first equation, so equation number 1, is useful both for testing both the Taylor rule and the solvency rule. So the data we use are United States data from 1988 first quarter to 2016 fourth quarter, and our variables of interest are the federal funds rate, the real GDP logarithms, and the price inflation, and the real interest rate. Finally, the total non-performing loans for commercial banks in logarithms. All series are stationary, and so I will quickly go through the VAR analysis, but I don't want to be technical on that. The fact is that when you do a VAR analysis, you start from a reduced form equation, but then a reduced form omits the fact that there might be mutual influences among the contemporaneous variables within the period of observation, so among the YT, so basically. And this omission is done in order to keep the variables on the right-hand side of the equation as predetermined. But precisely because of this omission, the coefficients being estimated cannot be interpreted as genuine causal influences. So we have to move to structural VAR, which is an attempt to identify structural, that is causally meaningful relations among the variables. And the structural VAR lets the unobserved coefficients that describe the contemporaneous causal influence to appear in the equation. So in this case, it's gamma 0. Okay, I don't want to spend much time on that, but we assume that the epsilon t are independent. So the independence assumption is consistent with the interpretation of the elements of epsilon t as structural shocks, and each term influences each variable in its own independent way, and this is important when we go to analyze the causal relationship. So as I was saying, structural VAR is focused on imposing restrictions on gamma 0 so that it can be retrieved from the data. And okay, the matrix gamma I can be recovered from gamma 0 joined with the AI. So the important fact, apart from technicality, is that restrictions on gamma 0 are usually made starting from theoretical or institutional knowledge. So sometimes, even in the VAR context, which should be more data-driven than other econometric tools, there are heavy neoclassical assumptions which bring the model to confirm the Taylor rule. On the contrary, in this paper we apply an identification method which is focused on inferring the contemporaneous causal structure on the basis of the study of the reduced form residuals. So it is entirely data-driven, and we adopt here an approach based on independent component analysis. And this approach has been designed specifically designed for non-Gaussian variables, and this is the case. So we estimated two models, one with nominal interest rate and the other one with the real interest rate, and the results are robust. So I will show only the results for nominal interest rate. Okay, we have $2. Okay, let's go to the results. So first of all, we found out this causal structure between the variables, and this is shown in the figure. And it suggests that the federal funds rate, which we can consider here the main instrument of monetary policy, respond to GDP, non-performing loans, and inflation. So in other words, we found that movements in the policy instrument are caused not only by indicators of macroeconomic activity, but also by non-performing loans within the period. And this causal structure is robust also on different estimation methods of the model. All the variables contribute to determine central bank's action, but to see the effect of central bank's action, we have to look at the impulse response function. So is it that true that setting the interest rate directly affects inflation and the economic performance? We don't find great support for that. We observe in the red cycle right there at the bottom the impact of real GDP on federal funds rate, that one, and there is an impact. Then if we move to the right, to the other red cycle at the bottom there, we find that in response to a non-performing loans shock, the federal fund rate decreases by 20% between 5 and 10 periods, that one. And if we look at the other red cycle there, we see that the federal fund rate has a long-lasting significant effect on non-performing loans, so on the solvency condition of firms. And this effect increases over time, reaching a peak after 10 quarters, and it's plus 12%. Instead, the blue circle highlights the poor performance of the Taylor rule. So there is a small and not significant impact of inflation on the interest rate. There is less than 0.5% is and significant only between 10 and 20 periods is the impact of the interest rate on the GDP performance. And there is no small and not significant effect of the interest rate on inflation as well. So poor performance for the Taylor rule. This is confirmed by the forecast variance decomposition. We see the impact of the federal funds rate on non-performing loans and vice versa. So these are the results. I conclude very briefly. So in our paper there are no a priori assumptions. So to identify the causal structure of interest, and the policy instrument, nominal or real interest rate, responds to immediate change of all the variables relevant to both rules. This is the first result. Then we have that the effect of a monetary policy shock on GDP is significant only after about 2 years. Before that, it is ambiguous and insignificant. The effect of a monetary policy on inflation is ambiguous and insignificant for all the periods. And the effect of a contractionary monetary policy shock on non-performing loans is positive and significant after about 1 year, and for a long period of about 4 years. Specularly, the effect of an expansionary monetary policy shock on non-performing loans is negative. In sum, these results shed important doubt on the ability that central banks have on influencing prices, as described by the Taylor rule, and provide new evidence to the alternative view associated with the Solvency rule, according to which the prevailing outcome of the policy decisions of the monetary authorities is the regulation of firms' insolvency. And that's it.
I would like to sentences. And if you look in chapter 17 of the General Theory, Keynes says that money and all liquid assets have two essential properties. One is that the elasticity of production of these things are zero. In other words, money doesn't grow on trees, because if the demand for money increases and it grew on trees, entrepreneurs would hire more workers to harvest the money trees. So that when you go for liquidity, you are going for something that will not stimulate employment. And the second essential property of all liquid assets is that the gross substitution between liquid assets and producible goods is zero. So when you go for more liquidity, you may increase the demand price for liquid assets, but that doesn't encourage you to substitute the now relatively cheaper price of productive investment assets. So it's these two essential properties of money and all liquid assets that create unemployment. And that's, of course, and I should point out, Milton Friedman found this out, and he decided to change the definition of savings. I don't know how many of you realize Milton Friedman, in his permanent income distribution, says savings is not going for liquid assets. When you save, you buy a durable good. Why? Because income is utility. And when you buy if you buy a non-durable, you get all the utility immediately when you consume the good right away. If you buy a durable good like a car or a yacht or something like that, the amount of the durable that you consume is just the amount that wears out in any period. The rest of the durable still has utility stored in it, and that's savings. And therefore, he concludes, therefore, savings, under his definition, creates as much jobs as consumption. And therefore, Keynes is wrong when he says savings doesn't create employment or destroys employment. Keynes' basic argument is that when you save, you go for liquidity. Liquidity is a non-employment inducing demand, and savings finds, as Frank Hahn says, the savings finds a resting place in non-producibles, and therefore that's what creates unemployment. So if you save, in order to keep income up, somebody else has to dissave by the same amount in order to keep income at the same price. And typically in the private sector, it's investors who are dissaving to provide investment goods. When they don't dissave, who's going to dissave? Well, nowadays we know, for example, consumers can do it because they have credit cards. But in Keynes' time, they didn't have credit cards. So the only other ones who could dissave were government dissave. And now we even encourage students to dissave by taking student loans. But will they dissave enough for offset private savings? Question. Okay? I hope now you'll read the General Theory, particularly chapter 17.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Li Huiqing. I come from the Central University of Finance and Economics at Beijing, China. So I'm very honored to join this conference, and I flight 17 hours from Beijing to Kansas City. So I'm still struggling the jet lag. And please excuse me and feel free to interrupt me if there is anything unclear about my presentation. This paper relies on a simple yet intuitive model to explain the behavior of long-term interest rates on U.S. government bonds. Our simple model is based on John Maynard Keynes' perspective on the government bonds yields. Keynes respect that the central bank actually determines the government bond yields, because the central bank is able to influence the short-term interest rates mainly through setting the benchmark policy rates. His view is that short-term interest rate is the main driver of long-term interest rates. This paper's contribution lies in presenting a simple yet intuitive model of government bond yields, providing an empirical evidence to support this model, and critically examine the role of government bond indebtedness on both the long run and short run basis. Our empirical findings confirm that short-term interest rates are the most important determinants of long-term interest rates in the United States. Moreover, contrary to conventional wisdom, we find that higher government indebtedness has a negative effect on long-term interest rates, particularly on a long-run basis. In another way, we find that a rise in physical balance ratio, which is government net lending or borrowing as a share of nominal GDP, lowers yields on the long-term U.S. government bonds. In the model estimation part, we also estimate both short and long-run effects of short-term interest rates, the rate of inflation, the pace of economic activity, and the physical balance ratio on long-term interest rates. Overall, our findings reinforce Keynes' insights on the determinants of government bond yields. Keynes recognized that the ultimate foundation of interest rates lies in human psychology, social convention, and liquidity performance. However, he also maintains that in advanced countries, the central bank is the main driver of both short-term interest rates on treasury bills and the long-term interest rates on government bonds. He holds that the central bank influences the long-term interest rates on government bonds mainly through the short-term interest rates and the various monetary policy actions. In both his treatise on money and the general theory, he notes the close ties between the short-term interest rates and the long-term interest rates. In Keynes' view, investors cannot estimate the mathematical expectations of the unknown and the uncertain future. The investor resolves to infer the future from the present and the past conditions. As a result, the factors that affect the current condition and expectations regarding the near term also affect the long-term outlook. This is a key reason why long-term interest rates move closely with short-term interest rates. However, recent theoretical and empirical work on the determinants of government bond yields and the sovereign bond spread do not consider the Keynesian perspective. Instead, the conventional view is that government financial variables, along with other monetary variables, have a decisive influence on the long-term interest rates on government bonds. particularly in the long term. In this view, an increase in government debt ratio is associated with higher government bond yields. This view is widely spread in the following literature. Keynes' view on the drivers of long-term rates is in contrast to this conventional view, but it has support in the modern monetary theory. The proponent of modern monetary theory, such as Ray and Geneva and other post-Keynesians, also gave the central bank a critical role in determining long-term interest rates and the government bonds. Okay, I think I will skip these figures to save some time. Go to the data session. So in the empirical part, we use several variables. The first is short-term interest rates, which is obtained from the nominal yields on U.S. Treasury bills of 3 and 6 months tenors. Second, long-term interest rates are obtained from the nominal yields of long-term U.S. Treasury securities of 2, 5, 7, 10, and 30 years tenors. The inflation rate data are based on two different measures, the CPI and the PCE. Then the pace of economic activity is calibrated by the year-over-year percentage changes in the seasonal adjusted measures of the index of industrial production. Business cycle conditions are represented by whether the economy is in a recession or not. The government finance variable is the ratio of federal government non-lending or borrowing to nominal GDP. It doesn't show the, I check this. I don't know why it doesn't show that. Yeah, this one. But it doesn't show.
Because it's hidden, maybe the slide is hidden or something.
Yeah, now it's okay. So let's go to the model estimation process. This part includes the following 4 steps. The first step is test for stationarity. So we use EDF and PP tests. The results of the unit root test show that besides the industrial production variable, the variables are non-stationary in their levels but become stationary in their first difference. So there is a mixture of I0 and I1 process in the model. We chose the bonds testing procedure to create integration and error correction models within the ARDL framework. The reason is the bonds testing procedure within the ARDL approach can be applied irrespective of the orders of the integration of the variables, as long as their orders are less than 2. So this approach is relevant for the questions addressed in our paper. The second step is we'll go through the next slide. Maybe we don't add it. We can, yes, and next. Yes. The second step is testing for structure breaks. So we use several dummy variables to represent the breakpoints in the model. Yes, and the results in this table show that the null hypothesis is rejected by most models. So there are one or more structure changes are presented in the long-run co-integration equation. And 16 breakpoints are picked from this from the results. To select the best possible breakpoints, we use the modified Troll break test to all 16 days separately. And among these 16 days, we choose 5 breaks. And the third step is to test the co-integration, to testing the co-integration bounds test for the long-run equilibrium relationship. So as this table shows, the null hypothesis of no long-run equilibrium relation is easily rejected at the 1% significant level. The last step is estimating the long-run equilibrium relation and the short-run dynamic error correction model. Yes. The results indicates that the short-run interest rates, inflation rate, and the pace of economic activity have positive and significant relationship with the long-term interest rates. Importantly, short-term interest rates exert the most powerful influence on the long-term interest rate. Specifically, we find that when short-term interest rates increased by 1%, the steady state long-term interest rate would rise by roughly 44 basis points to 60 basis points. And the results also show that an increase in the federal government fiscal balance ratio lowers long-term interest rates on Treasury securities. Next. So this is the results of both the short-run error correction model. And most of the short-run coefficients are also significant, except for a few lag differences in short-term interest rates. And the signs of the short-run dynamic impacts are consistent with the long-run results. Next one, please. Next one. Next one. Yes. And for the stability test, we use the CUSUM and the CUSUM square to investigate the stability of the estimated coefficients. We can see the result confirms that there's no evidence of statistical significant breaks. So overall, this estimated negative relationship between deficits and interest rates not only provide evidence against the conventional views, such as the crowding out or the loanable funds views, but also implies that the modern checklist approach, which believes that budget deficit restore reserves, hence put downward pressure on interest rate, is more consistent with the historical facts of the United States. And I think that's all. Thank you.
One further thing I want to point out is this paper that I gave today is a summary of a chapter of my new book, which will be coming out in October. It's called Who's Afraid of John Maynard Keynes? And Amazon tells me you can pre-order it. So you can get it for, I think, under $25. It's read Amazon Direct. So I expect a lot of pre-orders.
All right, well, with that, why don't we take 10 to 15 minutes for questions? And maybe I'll kick it off. So one of the things that the Fed talks about a lot is the so-called neutral equilibrium rate of interest, R star. And their argument is that if they keep the interest rate below R star, then they'll be stimulative, and if they raise it above R star, they'll be restrictive. And this comes straight out of the neoclassical model. What does modern monetary theory sort of say about that? And what are the implications for policymakers? Would anyone? Sure. If you wouldn't mind using the mic.
Well, first of all, Federal Reserve does set interest rate policies, but that's not the main function of the Federal Reserve. The main function of the Federal Reserve is to make sure that financial assets that are traded in organized markets remain liquid. And when you had the quantitative easing, what was that? It wasn't to affect interest rates. The answer was people had bought all of these derivatives and thought they were sold to them as liquid financial assets. What do you need to be a liquid financial asset? You have to be able to be traded in a well-organized and orderly market, which means that there must be a market maker who makes sure that the price, if it changes, doesn't change too rapidly. What happened with these derivatives were they were in an organized market, but there was no market maker. So suddenly, and they were sold, Goldman Sachs said, they're as good as cash, which means they're very liquid, you can sell them easily. Well, when a couple of these defaulted, if I have a derivative, his defaulted, when is mine going to default? I better get out while I can. So everybody started to run to get out. Nobody would buy it, and the market maker would have been somebody who buys on his own account to prevent this from getting out. The price declined dramatically. There's an accounting rule that says if you have a liquid financial asset in your balance sheet, you have to carry it at mark-to-market price. Market price declines dramatically, your asset price declines, wipes out your net worth. Okay? So what QT did was to buy all of these derivatives and to buy government bonds to assure you the bonds are good. Why? Because then pension funds and other institutions that had bought these derivatives thinking they could earn more than the low interest rate that the Fed was pushing, suddenly found that their net worth was being wiped out. And Alan Greenspan doesn't understand why the entrepreneurs of these the managers of these didn't know. But Federal Reserve came to their rescue. Okay. Now Bill Black will tell you a similar thing happened with savings and loans. It wasn't the Federal Reserve that came, but you have to have a government agency who acts as the market maker of last resort. If you have some asset which declines, which is being held by a lot of important institutional as well as personal people. So I would say that right now the Federal Reserve is more worried about maintaining liquidity than interest rates.
To go to your question, I think you can go back to Keynes, and it's, I think, chapter 16, Paul will may correct me. But basically the idea is that this idea of natural interest rate is unsound because there is an infinite number of natural interest rate given that the supply curve, the supply of funds and the demand of funds, and a lot of funds are not independent. And so it's a theoretically unsound concept. And on the other side, so it's empirically difficult to measure, if not impossible. The variance for the institution is enormous. So it's not a practical policy tool that you can use to make a policy judgment.
Any questions?
Hi, I first have a question for Eric. So I was wondering your sort of approach to convertibility, right? How does it help us understand, for example, liquidity spirals and fire sales that occur during
I'm sorry, I didn't hear
liquidity spirals and fire sales that occurred during the collapse of Lehman Brothers, right? Because you can think of them as attempts to create at par before 2008 that go, like in many other cases, that go down in crisis. So how do we make sense of those through your...
Well, the answer is...
Finish my question is, how do you make sense of that? And it was for Eric as well.
Well,
and for the last presenter, I'm wondering whether what you're establishing is correlation or causality, right? Particularly when you're talking about the increase in public debt to GDP ratios leading to lower yields. I mean, can you say the same story for another country that does have monetary sovereignty, in the sense that it has a central bank that can print and that has autonomy to do things in terms of monetary policy? And this is not just a story about the US and factors like global savings glut determining or lowering the yields at the loan end. Thank you.
Well, part of the problem is with the when the Glass-Steagall Act gets canceled under Bill Clinton. It's an interesting story. Robert Rubin, I'm sorry, the lobbyist for Citibank calls Robert Rubin, calls up Sandy Weil, who's the head of Citibank, and says, you better get somebody from the White House to get Clinton to be for repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act. 2 days later, Clinton comes out for repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act. A week later, Robert resigns and takes a big job at Citibank, so we know who he got. But the problem has become, you see, is that with this financial market, people have started mixing what I call non-liquid financial assets. That is, where you have a financial asset, which is a debt or something or other, which gives you title to something, but you cannot readily sell it. And they start mixing them up with liquid financial assets, which are things that you can easily sell in an organized market at a good price. And so when Goldman Sachs or Bear Stearns or someone suddenly finds their balance sheet loaded up with these non-liquid financial assets or liquid financial assets that have no market price, there's a problem. And the problem is that the Bear Stearns stock is being held by Lehman Brothers as well as these other things. And so these things become contagious. And again, what you got to do is keep these too big to fail financial institutions apart from each other and not colluding with each other. That's part of the regulations, you see. And otherwise, what happens is that collapse of one leads to the network's collapse of the next one, and it becomes a sort of typhoid Mary disease. One gets sick, everybody gets sick, and it gets passed along, and the result is global financial crisis. So, and who's responsible? See, my argument is the Federal Reserve is responsible for this. The Federal Reserve, who had the responsibility of watching after Glass-Steagall after the act, started in the 1980s and early 90s, reducing the restrictions they had on Glass-Steagall. And finally, as I say, Clinton got it repealed or supported repeal in Christmas 1999, which is a great Christmas present to the world.
Yeah, I think Paul said it well. It's basically a problem of default and trust in the issuer evaporating, basically. And so you have to have someone that comes in and try to restore liquidity in some ways, even though that probably was not done in the appropriate ways. So,
Lee, would you like to respond to the quote?
The proponents of modern monetary theory, such as Ray and Geneva and other post-Keynesians, and also the conclusion of this paper is that the central bank has a critical role in determining the long-term interest rates for countries with monetary sovereignty. So this paper can be applied to other countries also with monetary sovereignty. So that's.
But do you think you'll find the same, that high public
We are
debt to GDP
doing,
ratios lead to
yes,
lower yields?
we are doing the same, applying the same framework to Japan, and the initial work support this idea so far.
Well, unfortunately, I think we have to leave it there because we have to get to dinner. But I would encourage you guys to catch up with the panelists afterward, and if we could just give them one more round of applause.